From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Monday, November 24, 2025. Australian Federal Police Commissioner Chrissy Barrett will work with her international counterparts to track down people she says are undermining social cohesion in Australia, including gangs who traffic illicit tobacco and Nazi supporters. The coalition is stuck at a record low approval rating of 24%. That's according to new data from Newspoll, and it's despite a decision by the Liberal and National parties to dump a net zero emissions goal from their policy platform and a promise to get tough on immigration. You can read our experts' analysis right now at theaustralian.com.au. US President Donald Trump is fuming over a decision by more than a dozen world leaders to defy his policy agenda. They went big on the Paris Agreement and net zero at the G20 Leaders Summit, and it's a sign the US president's global influence is on the wane. That's today's episode. In May, during a meeting with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa at the White House, US President Donald Trump made a startling claim.
So we take from many locations if we feel there's persecution or genocide going on. And we had a lot of people. I must tell you, Mr. President, we have had a tremendous number of people, especially since they've seen this. Generally, they're white farmers, and they're fleeing South Africa. And it's a very sad thing to see.
A week earlier, the United States granted asylum to 60 Afrikaners, despite denials by South African officials from across the political spectrum that any such persecution was occurring. But Trump felt so strongly about the issue that he boycotted the annual G20 Leaders Summit, which happened in Johannesburg over the weekend. Ramaphosa said it was a missed opportunity.
It's always best to be inside the tent than being outside of the tent. The tent is the G20. All countries are here, and the United States, being the biggest economy in the world, needs to be here.
And the White House, well, they disagreed. Here's Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt.
I saw the South African president running his mouth a little bit against the United States and the president of the United States earlier today, and that language is not appreciated by the president or his team.
In Trump's absence, world leaders who attended the summit, including Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, united in an act of defiance against the US president's agenda.
Now, the world's largest economies have defied Donald Trump by agreeing to a leaders' declaration at the G20, a unified plan that places strong emphasis on accelerating global climate action.
One by one, the leaders of major economies, representing 85% of global GDP and 2/3 of the world's population, rejected Donald Trump's view of the world.
You know, the old saying is that if you don't attend the lunch, you are lunch.
Cameron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent.
And to a degree, that's what we saw play out in Johannesburg. We had the G20 leaders there talking about their own agenda, and they put out a very, very traditional, if you like, rule of law kind of old-fashioned statement, which really strongly backed the climate change initiatives of the Paris Agreement, even talked about net zero, talked about the importance of free and fair trade across the world, and basically just how important multilateralism is, multilateral institutions. Of course, all of that is very anti-Trumpian. So if you like, we are seeing in this one of the very first examples of Donald Trump's waning influence on world bodies. It was really quite striking that the G20 felt brave enough to put out this statement. I think even as much as 3 or 4 months ago, they wouldn't have done it in this manner. Donald Trump is having a tough time at the moment. On his signature economic policy, his tariffs, which he levied across the world, he's finding, not surprisingly, that they're not helping in lowering consumer prices in the United States. Grocery prices are still very high, and in fact, earlier this month, he actually signed an executive order removing tariffs on a lot of food imports into the United States, including Australian beef. And the reason why he did that was because he's worried about high prices of grocery products, and that's leading to a demise in his popularity. So that's the first plank. The second plank, of course, is the United States Supreme Court is reviewing the legality, the constitutional legality of his tariffs. Now, they had a quick look at it the other day, the Supreme Court, and asked a lot of very hostile questions, which made a lot of people think that they might actually strike down his tariff regime when they deliver a final verdict, which will probably be in the first half of next year. So on that front, Trump is taking a bit of a battering. Within his own party, Kristen, his MAGA loyalists are asking questions of him that we haven't seen before. Of course, we've seen the spectacular fallout between himself and Marjorie Taylor Greene, the very prominent MAGA congresswoman who now says she's going to leave Congress after Trump fell out with her and branded her a traitor. Now, look, she's got a lot of popularity, a lot of support. That doesn't help Trump. There is a cohort of MAGA Trump supporters who are disturbed by, A, his fallout with her, his handling of the Jeffrey Epstein files, which, of course, he has been reluctant to have released all the way through. He is releasing them now only because he's been pressured to. And, of course, some isolationist MAGA identities are not happy with America's involvement in foreign conflicts still, from the Middle East to Ukraine to even Venezuela. So you put all those things together, Kristen, he's having a reasonably tough time at the moment, which we haven't seen him suffer, if you like, since he was re-elected. And in fact, Reuters poll released last week showed that his approval rating is now 38%, which is the lowest of his presidency. So it's certainly taking a toll.
You said there that if you don't attend the lunch, you are lunch. Cyril Ramaphosa said it's his position that boycott politics don't work. Was he right in this instance?
I think Trump wasn't wise not to attend. The G20 wouldn't be his favourite summit. You know, it's a lot about the developing world wanting things from the developed world. It's a very consensus-based grouping normally, simply because it's hard to get definitive statements from such a big, broad group of countries that includes, China, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, he boycotted on the grounds that he believes that white farmers are getting victimised and killed in South Africa, and that's part of the South African government's policy, and that's wrong. But that's not a massive reason for Trump to boycott the actual summit, I don't think. I mean, some of those claims are contested. You can take it either way. But the bottom line is that Trump, I don't think, wanted to come to this summit.
This joint communique, as you said, was unanimously endorsed by all G20 member nations except the United States. That includes the United Kingdom, Canada and China. Is Australia's participation likely to have any impact on our bilateral relationship with the US, do you think?
No, look, I don't think so. I think there's enough cover there, if you like, for Australia. I mean, Anthony Albanese was very careful in what he said. He certainly didn't say anything that would particularly upset the US. He's just had a very successful meeting, of course, with Donald Trump in Washington. The relationship is otherwise going well now. Trump hasn't beaten up on Australia with tariffs compared to other countries. I don't think there's anything that's going to be dangerous for Australia with this. But, it's interesting that as a group, the G20 felt the collective protection, if you like, of everybody pushing back against some of Donald Trump's agenda. They felt safe enough to do that in that group.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said at the G20 summit he won't limit Australia's coal exports and his government will support new gas projects as a backup in the transition to renewables.
All of the energy experts say the cheapest form of transition is renewables, backed by gas, backed by hydro, backed by batteries. That's Australia's position.
But just last week at the COP30 climate summit in Brazil, Climate Change and Energy Minister Chris Bowen endorsed a pledge to phase out fossil fuels in a bid to keep the global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So how does that wash on the global stage? Is the Albanese Labor government trying to have its cake and eat it too when it comes to climate?
To an extent, you could interpret it that way. I think Anthony Albanese's comments on gas definitely directed entirely at the domestic audience here. I mean, if he starts abandoning gas, then he's going to be in big strife with the electorate. So I think his comments, if you like, are the reality of where the government sits, probably rather than Bowen's rhetorical flourishes on these things. That would be my interpretation.
Coming up, what about Donald Trump's vision for Ukraine? The communiqué endorsed by all but one G20 member nation in Johannesburg on the weekend included a broad pledge to bring peace to nations afflicted by war. We've used AI to bring parts of the statement to life.
We will work for a just, comprehensive and lasting peace in Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the occupied Palestinian territory, Ukraine, as well as ending other conflicts and wars around the globe.
But ending the war in Ukraine is presenting a unique challenge. Last week, a 28-point peace plan drafted by the United States Special Envoy Steve Witkoff was leaked to the media. Ukraine wasn't involved in the formulation of that plan, and unsurprisingly, it looks good for Russia. It would require Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to hand over vast swathes of land to Russia and cap its ability to defend itself in future. It would also leave it up to Europe to deal with whatever happens after the fighting stops, and that's got some European leaders offside. Here's Cameron Stewart.
This is going to be a real test of Donald Trump's persuasiveness, if you like, but also how willing he is to really push this. At the moment, he's framing it to Ukraine, to Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader, as an ultimatum. He says, I want Ukraine to agree to this within a week. Now, Zelensky's been reasonably diplomatic. I think he's learnt from his previous fighting with Donald Trump not to come out swinging. But nevertheless, Zelensky said a remarkable thing to his people over the weekend. He said, we are now facing a very difficult choice between surrendering some of our dignity or losing a key partner. And it would be very difficult for Zelensky to sign this and remain in power in the Ukraine, I think. So Trump is under a fair bit of pressure to rebalance, if you like, this peace proposal. So it'll be really fascinating to see what happens in the days ahead. How far will he go down that road, or will he stand his ground and say, no, take it or leave it, this is what you've got?
Cameron Stewart is the Australian's chief international correspondent. You can read his commentary on Donald Trump's rough patch right now at theaustralian.com.au.